Imagine standing blindfolded before a firing squad. You hear the click of rifles being loaded, the cold wind brushing your face, your heart pounding so hard it almost drowns out the commands of the officer. You have only seconds left to live. Now imagine that you're suddenly pardoned. That moment between death and life, that razor-thin line, would change the way you see everything. For Fyodor Dostoevsky, one of history's greatest writers, it wasn't imagination, it was real. And it shaped some of the deepest, most haunting stories ever written. This is the story of a man who stared into the abyss and came back to tell us what he saw. Fyodor Dostoevsky was born on November 11, 1821, in Moscow, in a small apartment on the grounds of a hospital for the poor. His father was a stern, sometimes cruel doctor, and his mother, a gentle, devout woman, filled the home with the sound of prayers and the smell of old books. Young Fyodor learned early what it meant to live between two worlds, the cold rationality of medicine and the warmth of faith. But tragedy struck early. His mother died when he was just 15. His father sent him off to a military engineering school in St. Petersburg, hoping he'd become a practical man, not a dreamer. But Dostoevsky was never meant for blueprints and measurements. He was drawn to stories, to people, to the mysteries of the human soul. At night, while his classmates slept, he devoured the works of Pushkin, Gogol, and Shakespeare. By the time he was in his early 20s, he had decided he would be a writer. And his debut came with a bang. In 1846, he published Poor Folk, a touching story about two impoverished lovers exchanging letters in a cruel city. The Russian literary scene went wild. Critics hailed him as the next big thing, the new voice of Russian realism. For a brief moment, Dostoevsky tasted fame, admiration, and hope. But fame in Russia was dangerous. You see, Tsar Nicholas I ruled with an iron fist, and any hint of social criticism was viewed as treason. Dostoevsky, idealistic and restless, joined a small group of intellectuals called the Petrushevsky Circle, people who dreamed of reform, equality, maybe even freedom. They weren't plotting a revolution, but they were discussing forbidden books and radical ideas. That was enough. In 1849, Dostoevsky was arrested. He was thrown into the Peter and Paul Fortress, a grim, freezing prison where he spent 8 months waiting for trial. Then came the sentence: death by firing squad. December 22nd, 1849. A snowy morning. The prisoners were lined up in front of wooden posts. Their heads were covered with white hoods. Dostoevsky was in the second group, meaning he would watch the first group die before his turn. The rifles were raised. The order was given. And then, chaos. A messenger galloped into the square shouting that the Tsar had decided to pardon them. The execution was a lesson, he said, a staged act of mercy. Dostoevsky's death sentence was replaced by years of hard labor in Siberia. He had come within seconds of dying, and that moment never left him. Later, he would write in a letter, "To be too soon or too late, that is the whole of life." Siberia was hell. He was chained at the ankles, forced to sleep beside murderers and thieves, forbidden to read or write. Winter froze his hands, summer brought disease. But he watched. He listened. And he began to understand something about human beings that no book could teach him. He saw guilt and redemption, cruelty and compassion, often in the same person. These men, broken by life, still prayed, still hoped. He realized that suffering was not meaningless. It was, in some strange way, the path to understanding oneself. When he was finally released after 4 years, Dostoevsky was no longer the young revolutionary he once was. He returned a changed man, spiritually awakened, emotionally scarred, and obsessed with the question that would define his work. In the years that followed, he wrote feverishly, often in poverty. He gambled away his earnings, struggled with epilepsy, and lost his first wife and brother within months of each other. There were moments when he was so broke that he had to write entire novels just to pay off debts. One famous example, The Gambler. He dictated it in just 26 days to avoid losing his publishing rights, and ironically, it was a story about a man destroying his life through gambling. But out of that chaos came greatness. In 1866, he published Crime and Punishment, the story of a young man, Raskolnikov, who murders an old pawnbroker to prove he's above moral law, only to be destroyed by guilt. Dostoevsky's portrayal of the human conscience was so raw, so real, that it changed literature forever. It wasn't just a crime story, it was an X-ray of the soul. He followed it with The Idiot, Demons, and his masterpiece, The Brothers Karamazov. Each novel wrestled with faith, free will, and morality. Timeless questions that still echo in modern psychology and philosophy. In fact, Sigmund Freud later called The Brothers Karamazov the most magnificent novel ever written. Friedrich Nietzsche, though often at odds with Dostoevsky's religious worldview, once admitted, "Dostoevsky is the only psychologist from whom I have anything to learn." By the time Dostoevsky died in 1881, Russia was changing fast. He didn't live to see the revolutions that would come decades later, but he sensed them. In his writings, he warned of the dangers of ideology without compassion, of trying to fix humanity without understanding the human heart. He once wrote, "If someone proved to me that Christ was outside the truth, I would rather remain with Christ than with the truth." For Dostoevsky, truth wasn't something you found in theory or logic. It was found in the struggle, in pain, in forgiveness, in love. His funeral was attended by tens of thousands of people, from beggars to aristocrats, proof that his words had touched something universal. Even today, over 140 years later, his works are still read, studied, and debated all over the world. He turned his darkest moments into art. He turned near death into enlightenment. And he showed us that to understand others, to truly understand them, you first have to face the darkness within yourself. So the next time you open Crime and Punishment or The Brothers Karamazov, remember, these weren't just stories. They were born out of the mind of a man who had already died once and came back determined to find the meaning of life itself. Because sometimes it's only when you lose everything that you start to see what really matters.